gentlemen, I am honored to introduce Dr. Gillian Hadfield.
Thank you very much. All right, and all it takes is about 4 people in a room to make a difference to most of the problems we're talking about. So I'm delighted that that you're here, and I want to say thank you so much to Palma for suggesting this, organizing this, and for everybody who's worked with her in putting this together. I'm really honored, and I'm really very grateful for the work that people have done engaging with the book. Danielle, Ed, Father Sean, it's quite moving, and this problem is so huge, and I think you get a sense of that. It's a big book. This was about 10 years of my life writing this book. It changed and morphed over that period, and things that many of the things we've talked about today aren't in the book. It spans so much, and I think what I want to do with these comments, there's a number of statements that have come across during the day that I so really resonated with. Palma, when you started us off with law helps us figure out how to be together as a community, and I think that's really very, very central. Let me say a little bit about where the book came from, in a sense. So a couple of stories about how I found myself on this research agenda. One is how did I end up doing law and economics in the first place, which was a combination which I thought I had invented at the time as an undergraduate when I was headed off. I discovered that I was near the beginning of it, but I wasn't the first person. And that was actually reading John Rawls' Theory of Justice when I was an undergraduate in a philosophy class. And what really struck me about Rawls was here was somebody engaging with the biggest questions we face. How do we live together as communities? How do we live in legitimate, stable, supportive communities? But he was bringing to bear, as I read it, very careful, structured, almost scientific type reasoning for that. And that's where I said, that's what I want to do. I want to be engaged on those big questions, but I want to be engaged with them in these very structured, predictive, how do you actually do something about this? How do we not just say what should the world look like, but how do we get it to look like that? So that's what took me into law and economics, and I would say that's the tension I feel, and I sometimes have felt listening to the comments, is between this is a book about justice, but it's fundamentally about the economics of that. But as you peel that onion back, it's so hard to keep them separate. So Danielle, there's definitely things that are not in this book, and in parts of my other work on access to justice that I have addressed, and that I feel, maybe that's the next book or the more to be said about that. But there was a definite, impetus to try and focus on the economics, and then coming back. I'm sorry, I keep forgetting that I don't have this one here. And Father Sean sort of emphasizing this, and as an economist for me, looking around the world and saying, we have to recognize that if you don't build the basic economic infrastructure for wealth, we can't do anything else. And I think that's part of the arc of the book, to sort of walk us through the evolution of human societies and say we have been on a path. I do think the arc bends towards justice, but it is long and it's expensive. And to protect human rights, to support equality and so on, we need wealth. And so I think the economist part of me says we have to focus on those issues as well. The other story about where this book comes from, which you won't find a discussion of in the book, was actually my own engagement with the legal system as a client, as a parent who got divorced with very tiny children, and found myself, this is now 25 years ago because the youngest is 25 and a half and he was 6 months when it started, found myself caught in a system that drained every penny of money that I had, that I felt only increased the levels of conflict in the family, stretched on for, well, I mean, in one form or another for practically 16 years, put me into bankruptcy, took everything I owned, and I turned around and I said, and here I am, I have got to be the most privileged person to deal with a situation like that. I'm a lawyer, I've got a PhD in economics, I'm very wealthy, I have an incredible network of people to turn to for advice, for help, for support, and it's devastating to me. And all I could think of was what is it like for anybody else? So at that point, I think I felt I needed to redirect my work to this topic, but at the same time, I didn't want to write about myself. I didn't want to write about family law. I didn't want to write about the ways in which I felt that my constitutional rights had been infringed or how I'd been harmed by this process. I didn't want to write about myself. I said, look, I'm a lawyer and economist. I own this system. I need to do something to figure this out. And that was really the beginning of the process of starting to ask, how could something that is so important, so fundamental, work so badly? And I started talking to lots of people, and eventually I'm talking to general counsel at large corporations. And you know what? They're telling me the same thing that I'm experiencing. They're talking about something very different. They're saying it's too expensive. It's not solving our problem. It's not helping. It's not, our lawyers don't understand our situation. I'm saying, well, they're talking about how do they expand into China, and I'm talking about how do I manage my family life. But it's all the same thing. So I think part of the challenge of the book was to address kind of that, all of that in some way. And it's a very difficult thing to do, and I really appreciate the ways in which people have engaged with it. But there's always that tension, and Danielle, you made me think a lot about is with you know, the invisible rural communities, communities of color, what's the Trump, Brexit, all of which was happening as the copy edits were getting done. And I got calls initially from the press saying, can you speak to journalists about this? And saying, oh, my book doesn't say anything about those things. And then a little while later say, well, actually it does. It's just, it's underneath, because it really is, you know, about this point that the infrastructure of rules is just fundamental to the way our human communities work. And we're at a point where I think we have lost the functionality of those systems, and we desperately need to recover it in so many different domains. And I think that's what hits me as I listen to the comments from Ed and Danielle and Father Sean, just all the different ways in which we need to be addressing these issues. There's a line in the book that, are you allowed to have your favorite line in your own book? I hope so. People who don't think the rules care about them don't care about the rules. And so for me, I see a real crisis that there are so many different places where people are saying, I don't see myself in this. I don't see my needs in this. I don't see what has to be accomplished. And I think we need to fix that. I want to say a little bit about the solution, the diagnosis that I offer in the book. One diagnosis, I mean, there's lots of things. But what I'm emphasizing is I think that our legal systems, our methods of producing law and legal infrastructure have become so closed and, to be honest, so controlled by lawyers that we've cut them off from their ability to adapt and change. So that actually the solutions we are coming up with today, we have fewer of them coming up because there is rather late in the process a line that gets drawn around that says this is the province of government and this is the province of lawyers. now I'm going to lose track. There was a comment at the very beginning about to be able to, you know, can we even imagine that there might be a world where we didn't have, you didn't have lawyer licensing? And I say, well, actually we did in the 19th century in the United States. There was a populist revolt that said, no, anybody should be able to provide this kind of help. And I actually don't ever advocate complete deregulation of the legal market. Sorry, Ed, that probably would be your preferred solution. But I do think it's absolutely critical if we are going to address, for example, the issues that Danielle was bringing to the fore about the inaccessibility and I mean, hardly anybody has access to legal aid, but you have even less in rural communities. And so this is the economist part, and I just want to sort of emphasize the biggest barrier to access to justice is the cost of the system that we as lawyers have created and continue to protect. And the solo and small firm practitioner, and I really appreciate Danielle's comments about maybe it's not all about specialization, and there's a whole set of skills, some of which are generalist in nature, and I agree with that. Just like we do want a doctor who has some bird's eye view of our circumstances, and our family practitioner who can bring in specialists as we need. That's a very helpful bit of feedback on that. But the solo and small firm practice is economically not viable. There are recent surveys, for example, of that the average small firm lawyer, 1 to 12 people in a law firm, in an average 8-hour day is only doing billable work 2.2 hours, only billing for 1.8, and only collecting for 1.6. Well, and you're only getting paid for roughly an hour and a half a day. You have to charge about $200 an hour to even make a basic income. So part of the story is about markets for opening up our markets for legal services and allowing those costs to come down and to recruit more innovation. The other is about what I call markets for law. And I do mean markets in the sense of people close to the problems coming up with the solutions. So even though I talk about it as markets, it's important, and Ed used the language of private solutions. It is about nonprofits and organizations like Father Sean, you mentioned, sort of coming up with here's a local solution for this type of problem. And trying to think about ways in which we can get more of that into our systems. The part of the book that I didn't anticipate when I first started was the last third, which was about the 4 billion people living around the world who live outside of the rule of law, and the urgency of addressing that. And I think that I think there were some comments earlier about, there was a concern about, are we going to go into those countries and just, colonize and provide, our solutions and our Western solutions? And I do think that's something that we've seen as a major failure of our economic development strategies. On the one hand, we've recognized that governance and rule of law is fundamental to building economies in, as I say, more than half of the planet living on $8 or less a day. And yet, that doesn't mean what we've tried to do when we go and build legal institutions there. We've just kind of said, well, what do we know about law? It's courts, it's justice, it's legislatures, it's law on the books. And that hasn't produced rule of law. That has not produced stability and wealth. There's no shortage of law on the books in Guatemala or Mexico and these places. This has not produced legal order. And I think actually we're facing a world where unless we break that view that that's what produces law, we actually are getting in the way of the production of local solutions and more creative solutions. So part of the reason for the history in the book, which is going through what did medieval Europe look like, is to say, you know, before we had a lot of ideas about structured governments being the source of law, people kind of just came up with solutions. They said, let's form a guild, let's form a town, let's form a religious groups, let's form these organizations. And I think part of what is holding us back today is our sense that, well, it's something that happens with legal experts, far away from where the problems are. When Cambodia wants to join the WTO, they have to enact 37 laws that are drafted by teams that come from Japan and Germany and in the US, and are not really about how do we build the legal infrastructure that Cambodia needs, for example. So what I wanted to, there was a question earlier, how are we going to actually do this? How are we going to, I think it was a question to Danielle during the first part of the day. And I think number one is we need to change our regulatory regime for lawyers. And I think I think as lawyers and those of us who are trying to solve that problem, we should think of this as one of the, our highest ethical duty is to stop protecting the monopoly that lawyers are holding over the provision of legal services. I was at a national conference on access to justice on Monday. We had 100 people in the room. You name anybody in the country involved in this. And we still didn't get around to emphasizing that point. And I think that has to be taken on as fundamental. One of the things that I do when I'm got my access to justice hat on is just a little simple math, being the economist. What would it cost to give every household in the United States 1 hour of legal help on every legal problem? Well, we can go to our legal needs surveys. We can just do that simple math, and the number you come out with is $50 billion. The budget for the Legal Services Corporation is about $400 million. So it's important for us to recognize that the scale of the problems are tremendous, and we need to be figuring out. We have to become more comfortable with markets and recognize that we're going to have to generate some of those solutions. We can't do it all through legal aid. We can't do it all through pro bono. And then the second important move is to recognize that we need to come up with, I think, supervised ways for private groups to be producing more of our rules. I think we're facing just ramping up, accelerating rates at which we are looking for, we have a need for more regulation to manage a complex world. I do disagree with you, Ed, that I think you're equating law with government, and I think we definitely need rules. Human societies need sets of rules. We just need more creative and diverse ways of producing those. But they need to be responsive to communities. And at the end of the day, sometimes I think that the feelings of dignity matter more than anything else, and the capacity for people to see themselves in the sets of rules, so that it's not just maybe the rural community and the members of those rural communities having access to legal services. It's their communities feeling that they have a voice in how their lives are being organized. And that is something that's changed very dramatically in human societies very quickly over the last 100 years, which is a very short period of time for humans, is the extent to which the rules are being made further and further and further away. And I think that's a massive challenge for us to figure out. How can we figure out ways to manage a complex environment, and yet for people still at that local level to feel like this is still about me. I am still seen here. And I think so many people feel invisible. So many people feel invisible in that process. I think you can see that in Trump, election, Brexit, nationalism. Everywhere we turn, we can see that.